Everybody, Flash Rasm here with another Trasman Talks. Today we are talking with Tomo from Epic Tavern. How are you, sir?
I'm good, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for joining me. So, how's it going then? How's it going with the game launch? How have you found launching a game on Steam then? How's it been?
So, you know, those of us that worked on the game have been in the game industry for a pretty long time, and um, we launched the game in early access 5-ish years ago. We weren't expecting it to be going on this long, and there are a number of reasons for that. But probably the one I want to talk about right now is that in the process of working on Epic Tavern, I think we discovered um, sort of like a love of research and exploration of the ideas around storytelling and set in fantasy, of course. And so, we've been keeping the game alive and working on it and improving and adding to it for a very long time now. And so that's kind of as quickly as possible, sort of describing how things are going with the project,
So,
which also means, I guess, that it is not out of early access yet. And we do desperately want to get it out of early access.
so for those people watching who aren't familiar with Epic Tavern, can you give a brief lift pitch of what it is? Of the
So the probably the smallest description or the quickest description is that it's a we use the term management RPG, and it's set in a fantasy world where you run a tavern in that fantasy world. And then, kind of as to elaborate on that idea a little more, what the game is really all about is that as you run the tavern, or the person that runs the tavern, sort of the would-be or potential great heroes of the land are coming to the tavern, and you're getting to meet them, getting to know them, and start to send them out on adventures. And over the course of many adventures, and the game is sort of there's a decent amount of reading in the game, but the game is very much about pulling together parties of adventurers and sending them on the quests that get unlocked via interacting with characters in the tavern.
Because I've noticed there's two as you've talked about, there's two distinct parts of it. There's the tavern management on one part, and there's the adventure on the second part. And I find the adventure question part of it, I've got my head around quite easily because it's very easy for you to understand what you have to do. Obviously, while we're talking, I'll have an overlay footage from the game as we're talking. But then
Nice.
I've noticed on the management on the tavern side of it, I've really struggled with it. That's because of my own ability. It's two very different types of, to me it feels like to be very different types of games in one. How have you kind of found how have you found people's reaction to the tavern side versus the RPG questing side?
I think it really depends. We have some players that have an expectation that are sort of seated in management and sort of um, kind of the systems management side of games, and when they walk into the game, they're expecting more out of the tavern, and then they're often very surprised at sort of the depth and the richness of the storytelling side of the game, and of course vice versa. But that said, there are fewer probably sort of rich storytelling games out on the market, so maybe the actual constituent user base for those games is smaller, and so we probably get more people actually running into the opposite problem that you ran into, where they're having some difficulty wrapping their heads around sort of the nuance and depth of all this stuff that can happen depending on how you mix and match characters versus the stories. And then in some ways you're kind of wishing we had done more and added more detail to the tavern management aspect of things. Now, the way we see the game, it very much is two games kind of combined together, but we focus, or the objective of the experience is wrapped around sort of the unfolding story. Kind of the big thesis of the game is one of sort of sharing, or splitting between custom storytelling and procedural storytelling, and then this idea that the player sort of shares in that storytelling with the machinery or the game, to create what becomes, at least as much as possible, the feeling of a player authored experience, but with as much of the customer specific nature of having an actual story to explore or discover.
I do enjoy the tavern side of it. I do enjoy kind of the different characters you get in there, and actually trying to not talk to them, but engage them in the serving of drinks, trying to work out why this person doesn't like that or that person does, trying to work out why it's broken down. And then as characters come, trying to work, well, actually, he'll make a good quester. I'll pick him, otherwise I won't. What kind of, again, as we said, they're two very different games. What influences are behind those two different? What influences kind of driven you to that decision to go with your tavern based and your quester based? What influences have been put into that game, or have fed you to put your influence you into designing the way you've designed it?
Well, there are lots of games that influence Epic Tavern. I mean, any game that's going to be sort of what, at least on the surface, looks like somewhat of a genre mashup, or at least like a game mechanic genre mashup, is going to have lots of sort of parents in its concept phase. When we were developing Epic Tavern, we were very interested in the idle games that were emerging out there. I know a lot of people kind of have a negative vibe with idle games. As a game designer of 25 years, I stand by the statement that if there's only one genre that you are going to study deeply, that it should probably be idle games. Partially because it strips down the interactions and it strips down the reward structures into such a naked and elemental, fundamental thing that it's astonishing, right? That so many people may enjoy that game. And so when you see that happen, let's say you hate the type of game, something about it just deeply upsets you, it's still worth the research. It's still worth understanding how a game like Cookie Clicker can drive people with just numbers getting bigger. And then you take those lessons and you apply them broadly. But that said, aside from idle games or games that play themselves to some extent, there was a lot of that going on. We were also right in the middle of, and let's just go back 7 years from now or 6 years from now. We're right in the middle of a sort of a renaissance of rich storytelling games on Steam in this kind of like, $14.99 to $29.99 range, not directly connected to IPs, all kinds of interesting features getting mashed together and sort of enriching the storytelling experience. Some of that storytelling experience being kind of heavily influenced by the trajectory of roguelike games and how they kind of ascended and sort of crested since, although honestly roguelike mechanics are like the RPG mechanics of 15 years ago. Everyone's trying to stick them into their games. But yeah, so we have like a ton of the sort of play influences of for us at Hyperkinetic were influencing Epic Tavern, and also sort of the you can't disclude sort of the new explosion of tabletop and sort of how that intersects with Twitch. All this stuff just starting to feed into the bucket, and what emerged was Epic Tavern. And I think maybe not so much an influence as much as one of the driving forces of it was this, as veteran game developers or people who've been making games for 15, 20, and 25 years, which almost certainly means that we were part of the old console development industry. We, I think, grew up sometimes having some hostility or resistance to the idea of story and video game. We come from a time when mechanics were sort of everything, and kind of control responsiveness and gameplay was king. And unfortunately, and I'm embarrassed to say this really, back then we'd say, we'd try to push aside the story and focus on those mechanics. And I feel like something around the beginning of Epic Tavern's timeline is also, as developers, us sort of really appreciating that and sort of desiring to immerse ourselves and explore more deeply the ideas wrapped around storytelling. And naturally, the lead up to this point was that we, many of us have been involved in ever more sort of successful and nuanced storytelling aspects of the games we were working on. And the joke is sort of that you get a pack of systems designers together, and how do they explore something or research something? The way they do it is by trying to emulate it with systems. And so hence that sort of important piece of Epic Tavern, and this sort of simulating or trying to disassemble what storytelling is, as much to deliver that experience to the users as to sort of explore it ourselves.
My day job is as a SQL developer, so that's just like, yeah, you get a bunch of SQL developers together and we'll try and copy that, and then you do your best efforts to kind of mirror it and replicate it yourself. Yeah, I've been involved in many of those conversations in my time.
Well, and it's interesting. Something is, I've sort of evolved towards describing games as simply a description of an idea. Any product we pick up, anything we play, yes, the developers created a thing, made a toy, or made a path for us to follow, but really the act of making it is describing the idea. And I think it's right. And then when we have this describing the product as a description, now we're in a better place to describe, or to talk about how good the description is.
Yeah. So then, obviously, for those who've played it, obviously the opening scene is of telling the story of happened 14 years earlier as the great adventurers stop the Netherkin to then save the world. Is that something you're going to see as we go through the story? Because the progression I've made so far with it, I'm still doing quests in and around the area to build up my tavern. So is it a case, are we going to get a central storyline, or is it going to be just a open sandpit mode, or are we going to get a bit of both? How do you envisage it being when we get out of early access?
So hopefully it's well before then, but and I think to kind of answer your question, I think that we don't give enough connecting dots between the beginning and picking up the large story arc. And so definitely in the context of Epic Tavern's larger story, it fixates centrally around that starting point relating to that Flaming Gate and the Netherkin invasion, the party of adventurers that closed the gate 10 years earlier. Like, they're sort of central. Your role in all of that is very central to the large story arc, and all the sandbox stories are there just to kind of create a detailed backstory for yourself and all the characters that you choose to use. And then part of the idea of Epic Tavern's sort of larger structure is that there's a big arc that leads to some conclusion. That big arc starts with that sort of cutscene at the beginning of the game for the prologue quest, and it'll end on a note that's very related to that. And along the way, many things will happen. The characters that you chose to cultivate, they'll become the heroes of that story arc. And then once it's done, they're the veterans of that story arc. And our part of our kind of long-term goals is that either DLC or updates of sorts add another large story arc to that. Now, granted, we may have made that period of time to kind of complete that story arc might be a bit too long right now. It probably takes like a good solid 50 or 80 hours to kind of get to the end, or get back to and conclude what started with that prologue. But definitely that is our goal, and that's sort of the idea of this sort of sharing procedural and custom storytelling. It's a custom outline with varying degrees of sort of procedural filling.
So in terms of the roadmap, because when you go into the game, you can hit the roadmap and it takes you to your Trello board. So if you got like kind of like January, February doing this, April, March this, May this, have you got a slow structure basis, or is it a case if you've got a massive bundle of work to do and you're picking it off as you go through?
So we have a medium-sized bundle of work, and we have been picking stuff off as we move along. And I think we used to have, maybe years ago, we would have dates associated with our targets. But as a side effect of the game taking so much longer than we wanted it to, Hyperkinetic Studios stays afloat through client work. And so Epic Tavern is basically all of our profits go towards the development of Epic Tavern. And as a result, depending on how things are going in any given season, depends on the amount of support Epic Tavern can get directly. That said, we do feel like we're kind of coming up on the doorstep of early access. There are a very limited number of things that we feel are necessary to create a complete experience. And once that is done, we will definitely move to remove early access from our title. And that said, that's in no way the end of anything for us, other than the end of the words early access. It's just that I guess from a philosophical standpoint, or whatever our ideals are, we're going to, our goal is to stay in early access until what's in the software represents a complete experience.
You were saying, again, you said it's been in development for a long time, and you've talked about, you've alluded to it. Have you found stuff that you've done, but start the process, you're looking at thinking, oh, I'm gonna have to completely rebuild that? Have you found a lot that way when you've done stuff years ago that you're now looking at again and you have to completely redo that? How much is the length of time it's taking hindered you, and how much has it helped you? I know you've talked about a lot more. It's enabled you to get a lot more into the storytelling side of it. But on the flip side, have you also found that it's also hindered you because you've done things years ago and now you think, actually, I want to do it like this?
Yeah, no, there's definitely a decent amount of rework, although probably one of the big reasons why we're taking so long is also one of the big reasons why we haven't lost so much work. I think a lot of us had worked on the Spider-Man 2 title for the 360 PlayStation 2 back in 2004, and we've always been sort of in love with complexity, in love with systems connecting to systems, or options connecting to options, and there being this sort of like healthy circulatory system of state changes and feedback to the player versus new options to the player. Granted, in the context of Spider-Man, a lot of that is millisecond by millisecond, but it actually all kind of connects in very much the same way. And so we were very focused on creating a very general and flexible system at the beginning. And of course, in doing so, you actually diminish or add a lot of friction to your ability to kind of close threads and make specificity in that system. And we ran into a lot of difficulties with respect to that. And some of that took a lot more time than we were estimating. But the flip side of it is, because of all the foundation sort of having a very sort of open and generic formats that connect to yet other generic formats, our ability to kind of, in a very agile sort of way, sort of kind of like unscrew pipes and rescrew pipes in together and try out all kinds of different ways of sort of expressing the story. I'll get back to that in a bit. Accommodated a environment where very less was lost than may otherwise have been the case.
I noticed when we're in the tavern mode, you've got things like competing with rival taverns. Is that going to be a big part of the game where you're not only questing and and building your tavern, you have to compete with other taverns as well? And how's that going to manifest itself? Is it a case of like you might lose quests to other taverns, or?
So the rival taverns idea is sort of multifaceted. I think at the top level, our goal is to create a feeling that you're not alone, to create sort of some amount of energy out there to kind of give you a feeling that you need to perform better, something that you can compare yourself against, and then to actually the feature set that would kind of express a lot of that. One is the obvious stuff that we already have, is stuff inside the scope of the way we tell stories. Some of the things relating to this rival taverns would be some storytelling and or kind of communication pathways that would exist in the tavern that don't currently exist, ways to kind of get information that if you think of like the questing experience, that there's lots of different ways you can get little bits and pieces of the story. And in the tavern, there's sort of fewer ways. So part of it would be adding to that so that you could be learning about the status or progress of rival taverns, or rival taverns could thwart or kind of, cause you a little bit of trouble in the scope of the tavern. And then another side of it, which is a little more mundane, but probably functionally probably what we'd expect to get the most effect out of, and it'll be the first set of features almost for sure, is what really amounts to sort of a glorified leaderboard, or a glorified fake leaderboard structure, where you'll be able to sort of see the performance of the other taverns and be able to sort of track your own progress against them. And in that little bubble of it isn't very much so, it doesn't really create the actual rivalry so much as give you an idea of your own progress. And then we kind of like sprinkle some story seasoning on that, where a characters could be lost to the other tavern because the other tavern attracted them, and then connected to that would then be features that are wrapped around characters being removed from your roster for various sort of important life events for them.
Is there anything particularly coming up that's really exciting you between early access now and full this? Is there any particular thing that's exciting you most that you really can't wait to show people?
So right now we're in the middle of probably the most important feature set to sort of kind of expand the player's experience out in the field during the quests. We have you see that there's hit points and spirit, and there are some things that can remove spirit. Spirit is a sort of a currency that you need to spend to use your event actions, whether they be the balanced action, the aggressive action, the cautious, or the support actions. They all have different costs, and some of the more convenient abilities or ones that allow you to sort of maybe subvert some of the normal elements of the system are more expensive and they cost spirit. And spirit's also something that's lost over the course of time traveling. And so we're in the middle of kind of pulling together a system where your characters will consume supplies. If they run out of supplies, they can starve, and all of the level of hunger that they have sort of has a strong influence on their spirit fitness, how much they recover and how much they lose over time. And then that's in addition to, in the events as you travel the road, that losses can be demoralizing. Let me take a step back. For us, spirit is kind of a combination of mana, morale, and exhaustion or fatigue. And so it's this kind of catch-all energy bar, and then the hit points, of course, is like sort of like a catch-all body bar.
Yeah.
But that system for us allows the player to kind of have an activity or action logic to the overall arc of a quest, rather than focusing on any given individual event.
We've got a Steam Next Fest coming up at the end of February. Will we see an Epic Tavern prologue demo in that Steam Next Fest? Is that something you've got?
I'm not sure. We've missed out on Next Fests because we're already out on early access, but I guess there's nothing stopping us from doing that. It's something we'd have to discuss internally. We haven't really been thinking about it, but I do remember last year's being a really outstanding Steam event, and a lot of great games were made visible. And I know, like, Seth is kind of a master of Next Fest too.
Yeah, it's a big one for us because a lot of games I've played I found on Steam Next Fest, because it's just kind of, it's a demo. It's back in the days, demos were the only way you'd find a good game was a demo.
Mm-hmm. No, and it's yeah. So we're interested, but we haven't been really deploying many cycles to that.
No. So how big is your development team then?
Right now, it's I think there's just 4 of us, and I don't think any of us have the luxury of spending every single one of our hours on Epic Tavern. That changes pretty drastically depending on the situation for the company. There have been times where we've had as many as 12 people on the project, and it's fluctuated a lot. And naturally, last couple of years have been just a little dampened.
Yeah,
for
challenging
for a million reasons. Yeah.
yeah. It's like it's been interesting for us, I reckon, that last
Yeah.
couple of years have.
And I'm grateful to have survived it without
Yeah.
too much difficulty. Honestly, it could have been that, things could have been much worse for us.
Yeah. Anyway, it's been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. So at the moment, we haven't got a confirmed release date, but you're aiming for at some point this year.
Yes, yeah. We were I think, we had some really solid plans if we were able to secure the resources to kind of hit early this year, but it's already early this year.
Yeah.
And some of that wasn't able to kind of come through. But yeah, this year, I would be surprised if this year if by the end of this year we're still early access. That would be very surprising for me.
So we've got a big few months coming up. So will we see regular updates of the early access going between now and release date? Or is it
Yeah, I think we'll see. I think we're going to return to our sort of pre-pandemic update schedule of an update every couple months. But we'll have to see. Like, things do come up. But it's nice, that feeling where you're eating away the crumbs of the problem space, and we're definitely there, at least in terms of crossing the line where we're confident that we'd be willing to not call it early access anymore.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Anyway, thanks very much for joining me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It's been illuminating. It's these type of things. I love these type of conversations, because speaking to a developer, you learn so much more about what's going on behind the scenes, as the challenges developers face between what we see on the front end and what you guys have at the back end. I love this conversation. So thanks very much for joining me.
Well, and it's something, we've been making games for so long. We know the syndrome, but you can't stop it from happening. Our understanding of the view of the player's view of us is not made better by the fact that we've spent years working on this game. Our view is this, like, it's such a well-seasoned view, but it's watching the player come to us. And if you want to improve their path, you have to turn your view around and see it from the player's view, and then make fixes. And what happens is, even the smallest distraction can result in you overlooking something important about a player's experience. I think as I get older and older and more experienced as a game designer, it's a strange realization to know what you can't do. And so it's, let me be specific. What I can't do is simply, in a holistic and effective fashion, imagine what it's like to be a new player of Epic Tavern. That's not actually possible. Instead, what I have to do is I have to build a perspective and use, like, an evidence-based approach to kind of build a profile of what it's like to move through the beginnings of the experience without having experienced it before, and then pick specific threads and then work on them. Not because when we're devising the systems of the game, that is, like, there's some intuition to it. There's a lot of experience to it. We know the interactions of systems. We're good at, like, experiential math, or, like, I have X choices and certain probabilities of success or failure, and I should have a certain amount of information to make that choice in an informed fashion. That stuff we can build, like, as if I was an expert at something. But what I can't do, is if I'm an expert at something, is understand what it's like to have done this the first time through. And I find that I never get sick of that revelation, sort of. Although it partly because it endlessly bites me in the ass.
It's remarkable things with game developers can do, to be able to not only do the coding side of it, but also do the whole big story build of it. So almost creating the coding is a bonus of the game. It's the flesh is all the concept around that. I think it's fascinating.
If I wanted to be really reductive, and I can say this with some amount of confidence, sort of like almost like a joke I've been telling recently, like the last 3 years, is that the human brain doesn't know how to do anything except for storytelling. It has no other way of operating. And the example I'm going to use is, stuff happens to me in my world, and obviously I don't know anything. I don't understand that. And so I take what has happened in the lead up to now, and I tell myself a story about it to explain it, to give it meaning, to make it make sense, to organize the events in my life so I can understand, I at least have a running theory of where I am and who I am. Now, we just hijack that mechanism to create entertainment. We also hijack that mechanism to communicate with each other. Like it's all of the things that humans do are a child of that thought process. In fact, I might go so far, and if I was going to write a book, I'd call it Building Blocks of Consciousness, because I've been calling this idea of how we storytell our lives to ourselves as the conscious part of life. I think that's what consciousness is, or at least a description.
I think you can see that when you see children play. My 8-year-old everything's about telling stories, and you can see that where everything you tell a story, and it's all around that kind of storytelling. I can see that completely.
And I can tell a really dry story if I need to.
It's exciting because there are a lot that you are starting to see more and more games that are storytelling, that are becoming not just kind of a game, it's becoming an entertainment, because you're it's like reading a book but on the computer without you able to affect that. And you see more and more games like that on the market, and there's certainly demand for it. I mean, right, I've covered several, and you can see the people want to play that type of stuff.
And it's super cool. Like the stuff people are coming up with is outrageous and super like nuanced, and like all kinds of interesting ideas wrapped up in it. Like to kind of go back to what I was saying about how when we make a game, we're creating a description. I think a very specific way to kind of create that analogy is like in a book I can read, so-and-so was strong enough to push aside the heavy rock. Right. And then if I'm going to play that description, which is still a description, there is some mechanic where I need to give inputs, and there's some challenge against some strength value. And then I can either move the rock or not. And if in the book I couldn't move the rock, they just say so-and-so didn't move the rock. And so that's to see those two things as the same underneath the hood, right? Because it's the same information that's coming to our heads. It's just the medium through which we sort of handle the imagination of it is just a little bit different.
Yeah, brilliant. It's been fascinating. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much, and good luck with this development. And I can't wait to see how it pans out and get more into the story, because the prologue's fantastic. I thought the prologue I really enjoyed the prologue. I enjoyed the prologue. It was really good.
Oh, I'm glad. It's been very interesting. Yeah, we've learned a lot in this process.
Yeah. Right. Thanks very much. And
thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
It's been a very fun conversation. And thanks everybody for watching. All the links for Epic Tavern will be in the description. Everything. So again, thanks for watching. And again, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.